welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am so excited about today's session, and I feel like it is the perfect time to discuss this topic. Here at the School of Professional Studies, just a couple of days ago, actually, we had an internal workshop where we were discussing how stressful and overwhelming the holiday season can be. And so I feel like a workshop that gives us the opportunity to take a step back, take a breather, and consider how our actions and our approaches do or don't build trust with one another in these particularly stressful and heightened times really couldn't come at a better time. So I'm very appreciative to our faculty for agreeing to lead it and for all of you for finding time in this busy and chaotic time to come and learn about this. My name is Allison Weiss. I'm the Associate Director of Corporate and Executive Education at the Brown School of Professional Studies. I'm really excited to welcome you here today. I have a couple of short introductory slides, and then I will welcome and invite on our faculty speaker, Ed Barros. So first, I wanted to give you just a little bit of a background about what the School of Professional Studies at Brown does in case this is your first time interacting with us. And if it is, welcome. If it's not, welcome back. But at the end of the day, our mission is to inspire and prepare you, graduate and professional level learners, with the skills and the confidence that you need to transform the way the world works for good. There's a lot of research that shows that the way the world works now does not work for most people. And so I'm really, really excited to see so many of you here today ready to step up and to build skills and build new pathways to make sure that the world finally does work for good. So thank you for being here. And our larger mission connects back to that vision by talking about how we're going to translate all of the research and the incredible academic resources we have at Brown in order to give you the skills to transform yourselves, your workplaces, and the communities you serve. So we're very dedicated to making sure that we give you the skills you need to continue to level up in your career and the skills you need to make a positive impact on those around you. And we hope that you'll consider us to be your lifelong partner in your continuing education journey. We offer 33 professional and early career masters. They are a mix of online, hybrid, and in-person options. We offer custom programs for your organization. So if you walk away today and you feel really inspired and you feel like, oh gosh, I just wish my whole team had been here today to learn about how to build trust at work, then we would love to work with you to design a program that will meet your needs in exactly the format you want. And then lastly, we offer over 30 non-credit programs that are short courses and certificates that concentrate on leadership skills, healthcare skills, and data skills, and then all the intersections between those three. And there are a couple specific programs that I want to highlight today in case you leave buzzing and ready to continue your journey with us. We offer three professional master's programs. The first is a master's in healthcare leadership. So if you are a healthcare leader with 2+ years of experience and you're looking to learn leadership, data-driven decision making, finance, and policy, we would love for you to join us. It is a 12-month program with 12 courses and 3 residencies. Everything else is online, and it has been called the best of an MHA and an MBA combined. Secondly, our IE Brown Executive MBA program is meant for those of you with 10+ years of experience looking to learn finance, marketing, operations, team leadership, and change management. It's a 15-month program with 5 residencies in 3 locations around the world, which is very cool. And it looks to help you to interpret disruption and anticipate what's next to bring clarity to complexity. And then lastly, our master's in technology leadership is for those of you with 5+ years of experience looking to learn analytical decision making, strategic thinking, AI, cybersecurity, and big data and leadership. And this is for both people who are in technology or adjacent to technology. It's a 12-month program with 15 courses and 2 residencies, and you'll learn how to navigate disruptive technologies for success. I didn't put this on the slide, but there are also 2 additional fully online programs, our Masters in Management and our Masters of Organizational Leadership, that also might be a good fit for you. And then lastly, I want to feature one non-credit program that I think you may be interested in if you're interested in learning how to build trust. Our Leaders Coach program is one of my favorite programs. I'm an alum of the program and I learned so much and it really transformed my leadership style. And this program is offered either as an intensive 3-day in-person session or a 6-week bite-sized online program where you're just meeting once per week. And you learn how to create a more empowering, motivating, decentralized leadership style that guides and motivates your team to their own conclusions, doing their own best work, as opposed to you having to jump in and do everything through learning 12 distinct coaching skills, learning how to listen, and learning how to conduct coach like conversations with people that report to you, with people you're in a horizontal team with, and with people that you are managing up to. So, this is one of my favorite programs as well. So, those are just a couple of our offerings if you leave wanting to learn more and wanting to continue your journey with us, which we hope you do. So with that, I am happy to introduce Dr. Ed Barrows and also actually, sorry, one more housekeeping thing. So I will be monitoring the chat throughout. So if you have comments or you want to add resources, or there'll be a couple of times where he invites you to the chat, please click on your bottom bar of Zoom, click on chat and enter it there. But if you have a question for Dr. Barrows, please click on your bottom bar of Zoom, click on Q&A and type and submit your questions there. And I'll be monitoring that throughout as well. And at the end during Q&A, I'll combine as many questions as possible so we can get to as many questions as possible. So with that, now I am excited to introduce Dr. Ed Barrows. Ed has worked with leaders at all levels in the areas of strategy, strategic leadership, and leader development for the past 25 years. He is an International Coaching Federation certified coach and a member of Harvard's Institute of Coaching. Prior to joining Brown, he worked as managing director at Duke Corporate Education, where he was responsible for designing and delivering programs for portfolio global clients. And prior to that, he was in professional services with Deloitte, General Electric, PwC, and the Palladium Group. So, what I think is so special about Ed, and he hates it when I brag about him, but I love doing it, is that he has the academic deep expertise from writing his 2 books, The 12 Skills, The Guide to Becoming a Strong Leader and Accelerating Your Career, and Managing Performance in Turbulent Times. And he has been faculty for a long time, but he also has been in your shoes working at a job day to day where he was applying these leadership skills in the messy environment of real life. So I think that's
Mm.
what makes you such an incredible teacher, Ed. And I feel very grateful that you're here with us today. So thank you for being here. Welcome. And I'll turn things over to you.
All right. Thanks, Allison. Appreciate the intro. Great to see everybody. There's people on the call that I worked with and had the pleasure of knowing. So some of you may remember Romper Room. So I'll do my intro. Hey, Brad and Dave and Laura and Robert and Rayhan and Elsa and every other folks that I missed. It's great to see you. Someone, Allison, does have their hand up. Joy has her hand up, I think. So before we begin, maybe reach out. But we will have an opportunity as we go through to, as Allison pointed out, put some things in the chat, which I hope you'll find interesting. As we talk about a topic that's kind of interesting, I think and certainly important at work today, the concept of building trust at work. So first off, thanks for being here. I know you have other things to do. So sharing about an hour with us means a lot. So my aim for the next few minutes is to try to make this valuable and actionable for you. So to blend the sort of 2 pieces of what does the theory and literature say about building trust at work? And then what are the things you can actually do to do that? So we're going to talk about that. So the objectives for today that were highlighted in the post on coming here, we want to understand what trust is and why it's so important. You may disagree, but you'll have a chance to think about that. We want to explore some of the elements or variables that go into trust in relationships in the workplace in particular. Although I would say that I think some of these variables transcend the workplace and can be used elsewhere. And then also, we want to talk about some of the common conceptions and misconceptions around trust. You'll have a chance to weigh in on that. And then really want to talk about how to strengthen trustworthiness on your own and in your own organization. So let's get going with that. So a little video about trust. Fall, and it'll be an exercise in building trust between one another. So Harrison, if you don't mind going first, step up here on this chair and close your eyes. right? And then everybody fill in, and we're going to ask you to fall, and then they will catch you. So you have to trust us. I'm going to count to three. Just relax and fall. Okay? One, two, three. Yeah. Harrison, or he's probably not going to be so trusting of his colleagues going forward. So, at any rate, just to kick things off, why is trust important? I'd love to hear your perspectives in the chat, as Allison pointed out, on why trust is important at work. That's really the context today we're going to talk about. So, why is trust important at work? Anything that makes it more important than other things at work? I'm trying to see if we have, so you can be honest. Yep, we want to be honest to be productive. Teams need to trust one another. That is true. Saves time. Interesting. Encourages confidence in and take initiative. These are good. Great. Uh, have the same vision. I like that about security. That's interesting because there's an element of risk taking. Understand others' abilities. Laura, take chances with innovation. That's very good. There's an element of psychological safety. We hear a lot about that in the workplace. um, is sort of a proxy for leadership to fulfill our job or mission. These are all great. So everybody brings, and there's going to be more chat questions, so keep them coming. Whether you want to put it in or not, think about, everyone has a perspective on trust, what makes trust actually occur and why it's important in the workplace. There's a lot of different reasons. It's interesting, this idea around efficiency. So I'm going to give you a definition. We're going to talk about some literature on this for a little while, and then we're going to get into some activities that'll help you. So really, when we think about it, trust at work is an enabler, if you will, that as a key mechanism provides us as employees with one another and with our leaders and managers in organizations to work together more effectively. Whether it's a performance multiplier, as Rita points out, or it contributes to emotional well-being, I'd say there's actually some of that too. It's nice to be appreciated, as we're seeing here in the chat too. But we want to work effectively in organizations, and trust is, I would say, an antecedent or even a foundation of doing that. So that's kind of the perspective we're taking today. And it's quoted, it comes out of this paper that I'm going to use as a reference for today. Now, why do we need to think about this? Well, there's actually very good reason, because it has very tangible benefits. And as you would expect from a public accounting firm, PwC, who's done quite a bit of research on trust over the past several years, it actually has an impact on the bottom line. So now this is a perspective from leaders who are surveyed, and I would encourage you to take a look at that survey. It's actually pretty handy. It's right sort of summarized on PwC's webpage. If you just put in trust survey for 2024, you'll find it. It's got a lot of good information there very quickly, but it impacts the bottom line. When we work productively with our colleagues, with our leaders, when we're trusted in the community, as you see when you look through the data in the survey, that's going to have an impact on our performance. Similarly, when we feel like we can't trust our colleagues or we can't trust the organizations that we work with, both inside and as partners or as consumers or customers, it's going to impact the organization's performance. Now, most executives here, 94%, say, there's still issues with trust. And we'll unpack some of those today. There's a lot of things that comprise trust, and we still struggle to handle all of the things that go into building effective relationships, both in and out of the workplace. And interestingly, we're pretty well trusted as employees in organizations. A large component, 86% of execs say you do trust our employees, which is good, right? The workplace has changed a lot over the past 5 to 10 years. There's still some room in terms of employees feeling like they are trusted. There was an interesting article in Financial Times about saying thank you or using good manners at work. Some of those things go into building trust-based relationships, which are really the key component that we're going to look at in a minute about trust overall. So there's sort of a quantifiable value to trust in the workplace, or in the workplace, at least there's a perception that there is. Okay, so let's talk more about this and really think about it. So when we think about trust, what is it? Whenever you do any kind of research, and I'm going to look at this from a couple different dimensions. There's sort of an academic side, and then there's going to be more of a practical side, which I think at the School of Professional Studies we try to incorporate. So we want to define terms first. You could use a simple dictionary. This comes out of this paper here, which is actually kind of a seminal paper relative to the study of trust. It's really the willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party based on the expectation that the other party will perform a particular action important to the person trusting, irrespective of whether or not it can be monitored or controlled. That's kind of an academic definition of act it is. But if you look at it, there's an element of the relationship. There's an element of expectations. There's an element of risk. And there's two parties in this. And the paper, which is from 1995, is actually quite useful. It's highly cited. And it presents a theoretical model. It's from the Academy of Management Review, which is a theory journal. And it's very useful in getting us to understand what are the relationships and causes of the elements and factors and variables that go into building trust in the workplace. Now, I wouldn't encourage you to read the paper, although you can if you want. I think the key elements we're going to talk about here today, but always we want to start with a definition. And there has to be some interaction between parties that enable us to have a trusting relationship. So that's really what we want to think about. Now, there's a lot of different ways to think about trust. I think most of us probably just think, trust is that thing. I can rely on other people. I feel, maybe we use psychological safety as a proxy. It's just sort of popularized these days. But when we think about trust and we think about understanding it, we really need to be a bit more precise in what we want to know. Is it the inputs to the trust relationship or trust process? Are the outputs or outcomes associated with trust? Is it the process of trust itself? What conditions have to be in place to have trust in a relationship or in the workplace? There are risks associated with it. What are those? Are we studying the risks? Are we looking at the consequences? Are we examining the relationships? And when we say relationships, is it between two people? Is it a group of people? Is it an organization? Is it the stakeholders of the organization? There's a lot of different ways to think about it. So we just need to be kind of precise in how we go about approaching this on our understanding and enhancing our understanding of trust. And there's a couple other things we want to think about. Most things have been studied, at least to some degree. What do we know about trust? We want to start with some literature. That's my job to summarize that and bring it to you and say, okay, here's some of the things that we know, and here's some of the things that we don't know. Now, what's interesting about literature, without going into too much detail, is the classes that we teach in business in general, it's not necessarily focused on contemporary research. The idea here is we want to find things that are trusted, reliable, and we can rely on. So it's okay to go back a few years to find a paper to explore. So what we want to really think about is this idea and narrow down the concept of trust to the functioning of trust or the operation of trust between two parties, in particular leaders and followers. That's what we're going to explore. So we want to look at it, and I use AI. A lot of people do. There's a AI application that does literature reviews. So I summarized and came up with a key question that I wanted to know to inform today's discussion. What are some of the antecedents and predictors that foster a bidirectional trust, dyadic trust relationship between two people? And those two people happen to be employees and their leaders, whether they be informal or informal leaders in workplace relationships, and it's agnostic in terms of industry. So it's probably more than you need to know. But the idea is to try to get our arms around what are the general conditions and things that factor into relationships that people have in the workplace, in particular between managers and employees. So that's kind of what we're trying to understand today. And the summary findings are as follows. So there's actually quite a bit of what's known about what causes effective trust-based relationships at work. And although it's kind of balkanized, and we know more about it from the standpoint of employees than we do necessarily employees and what goes into trusting leaders than we do vice versa, although I think there's a lot of similarities. And we don't know a lot about how it changes over time, longitudinally. So these are always factor into things that we can explore and further research if we're interested in doing that. So we're trying to assemble an understanding very quickly here of what constitutes trust. How do we look at it? So we're really looking at it today as relationships between two people or a dyad in the workplace that happen to be, but in not all cases, employees and leaders. So what does that look like? Well, let's think about this. And this is a model from that paper, which I think is actually kind of handy. And then I'm going to share with you, I'll call it a more practical approach. But this is a good idea of how we think in the academy and how you can think actually at work in terms of enhancing your ability to be more effective in your role, whatever it is. And we happen to be talking about trust. So I always encourage my students at some level, and I know a bunch of them are on here, it's not bad to approach your work and the workplace like a researcher or a scientist sometimes to try to understand what's happening. There's many things that are occurring that are not easily identifiable or understandable, but when we put them in some type of construct or relationship, it helps us understand how the world works, how in our world the workplace works. So I think this model is actually kind of handy. So I want to run through it, and then I'm going to get into some things that I think you'll find quite applicable. So we're really focusing on what the authors point out here is the factors of perceived trustworthiness. You see that in the dotted lines. And there's three variables that go into the factors, which are the factors themselves of what creates this perception of trustworthiness. We're not measuring it obviously in a theory paper, we're not measuring it directly, but we're trying to understand what causes trust. And there's three things: ability, benevolence, and integrity. Now, academics tend not to use terms that other people use, so we'll try to put those in terms that make sense. So think about a relationship between an employee and the leader. The leader will trust his or her employee, and I would say reciprocally the same thing is true based on their skills or abilities in their job. Okay, so if you were, most of us join the workforce as technicians. I was trained as an accountant. Some people are IT people, other people are nurses or doctors or lawyers or airline pilots or plumbers or whatever the case is. You typically go into the workplace with a emerging set of skills, and over time you build those skills to do your job. One of the key components to trusting somebody in a workplace relationship is their skills. Like, can that person actually do that job? Do they have the ability to do the job? So that's why training is so important for people, both at the technical side and the relational and conceptual side. So being trustworthy, think about an employee, and you can think about it as a leader. I mean, this is a school that teaches leadership, and most of you, if not all of you, are leaders. That person has to be technically capable and have the ability to do the job. They also have to have benevolence. What we mean by that is really this desire to do a good job, to create that trust-based relationship. So if you've ever worked with someone that doesn't quite have the desire, and they may have the skills, but not the desire, you maybe don't trust them so much as if they demonstrate consistently over time that they actually care and want to do a good job at work. So someone's benevolence, their ability and desire to do good is also factored into their trustworthiness, and then the trust relationship and the functioning of trust overall. And the last thing is integrity, which is really their values. Do their values around what's important at work and yours, if you're the leader, do those match? So we look at the first three variables into perceived trustworthiness as someone's ability, their desire, benevolence to do a good job, and then also their sort of personal integrity or their moral compass. Now, that's moderated by the trustor, in this case, we'll say the leader, his or her ability to trust. So if someone is highly trustworthy based on these variables, but I, as a leader, I just don't trust people, that's going to impact the quality of the trusting relationship as you see here in the model, right? So we call this a moderating variable. The idea here is if a leader can't trust, or an employee doesn't trust their leader, looking at it reciprocally, you won't have trust as an outcome of those variables combining in this particular model. So there's also a factor as we move to the right of perceived risk in the relationship. If I perceive there's a high level of risk in the relationship, there may be some organizational factors or some other conditions that impact that. It's going to dampen my desire or the ability for us, meaning me and the other person in a relationship, to take risks. And taking risks is something that's important in relationships, especially trust-based relationships, because we can't control for everything in the relationship. And then the outcomes are a function of all these variables combined. That's a lot. I recognize that. But really, we're asking about these three or four variables. Does the person have the skills as a leader or as an employee to do the job? Do they have a desire, the benevolence to do it? And then also, do they have the personal values that go along with it? And then is the leader able to trust? So I think this helps us, and we'll get a little more concrete here in a second. I think it helps us understand a lot of different things. First off, how do we look at the world from a scientific standpoint? Can we distill things down to a set of variables and relationships or the process that give us insights into what causes trust or impacts trust unfavorably in the workplace? And then we're able to take actions that actually improve that in all of our relationships. And I would also suggest that this can be used with some good effect outside of the workplace. Now, I have a set of questions for you for the chat. Now that we talked about a model that reflects, I think, a pretty accurately how we can examine our trust-based relationships at work, I want to ask you something about yourself. What's true for you about trust? And oftentimes this shows up in what we'll call maxims or little sayings we have about trust. Are there maxims that you have? And that's what I'd love for you to put in the chat. Are there any maxims that serve you well in your life? Are there any maxims that may be limiting, that hold you back? So I'll give you an example. One of the things I like to say, I tell my students and people I run across is I always say, never trust someone who says, you can trust me. Because I always think, well, if I can trust you, why do you have to tell me that? And as Tracy just put in hers, trust but verify. We've heard that in many situations. Once trust is gone, can't get it back. Right back to our video at the outset. Easy to, and it's a challenge to earn. It's hard to get it back. Yep. Believe in people if they really care. That's going back to our benevolence. Trust happens in small, I love that, Joy. In the small interactions, that's where the trusting relationship is created. Actions speak louder than words, right? These are some of the maxims that are really important. So keep them coming. But we all have them, whether we can articulate them or not. Bob, trust is built through presence, right? Showing up and being there, some element of emotion. Now, what I'm going to argue here is let's go back to our model and think about comparing ourselves, whether we're the leader or the employee. How well do we do in the area of some of those variables? Honesty lasts the longest, right? Good point, Carrie. I hadn't heard that one. My wife's German, but I'll have to ask her about that. So it's really interesting. So I'll tell you a quick anecdote. I had a student in one of my classes that I taught in one of our programs that Allison highlighted at outset. And he had really a very interesting view. It was really along the trust but verify. He said, I try to verify everything when it comes to a relationship and making sure that things can get done in the workplace setting. I said, hey, I understand you. I hear where you're coming from. I said, a lot of our courses are hybrid, so people come in from around the world. I said, how did you get here? He said, well, I flew. I said, great. A lot of people do. I said, how long did it take you to verify the pilot's license in terms of his flight hours or her flight hours and how much time they had put in? And he kind of looked at me funny, then laughed. And I said, the reality is we oftentimes take trust for granted. We like to think we have to only trust people. Maybe we only trust people when we verify things. But more often than not, we probably give people a lot more latitude than we may think we do when it comes to trust. So let's just think about this in maybe a more practical way. And one of the things I'm going to advocate and draw on for today's discussion, I'd encourage you to take a look at if you're interested, is this book called The Trusted Advisor. It's been around for a long time. And it actually has some very practical, useful, and I think you're going to find very relatable concepts back to the model that we talked about just a minute ago. And to Amina's point, this trust is a process, right? That's what we were looking at before. That model is, in fact, a process of what creates trust, or in fact, I would say deteriorates trust in the workplace. So again, something to think about. So we usually have some truths about trust. We don't think about them, but in the chat, these are the things that are sort of coming to the surface. So here's some truths that are out there. In order to trust, you've got to trust and be trusted, right? So if you go back to the model, you can be the most trustworthy person in the world as an employee. But if your colleague or your boss doesn't trust in general, it's going to be very difficult to have a trusting relationship because one party isn't able to extend trust to the other party. But it's a two-party relationship in the diet we looked at. Trust is very personal. I can say, look, I trust anybody. If you tell me something, I'm assuming at the outset I can trust you. Other people say there's no way I could possibly assume that. So there's really a personal element to how we go about trusting people. Trust is made, and we just saw that in the chat. Trust is really created in the interactions in the relationship. So in a dyad, two people, it's the relationship where the trust is created or deteriorated. And it's in those interactions that it happens. Things we're oftentimes not even aware of. Did I deliver the report on time? Did I send the email that I said I was going to? Did I demonstrate that I was honest when I came across something outside in the parking lot that wasn't mine in turn? I mean, all of those things ultimately go into our determination in relationships about whether or not we could trust someone. There is some risk taking. We can't talk about trust without an element of risk. That gentleman in my class, my student, that said, I only trust when I verify. There's, hopefully got a realization that more often than not, we don't verify everything we do extend trust, recognizing there's always some risk involved. There's an element there's a sort of paradox in trust, right? Embedded in it. In order to receive trust, oftentimes we have to be trusting. So this is where when we think about trust and how to create those relationships, we kind of give and get at the same time, which is creates the paradox. Listening, and this is kind of a little bit of a read ahead or foreshadowing of what I'm going to talk about later, is listening really drives trust and influence. And this is based on my own experience, probably more than anything else, something that people are generally not very good at. More often than not, we're really not listening to people when they're talking. We're thinking about all the things we have to do or something that's more interesting than this conversation I'm in right now. And that really does diminish our ability to understand people and trust. And I'll talk about that. It really doesn't take time to trust. You probably didn't think about anything if you went to work today about are all the other drivers going to be safe on the road today. The idea is we take for granted the fact that it doesn't take very long to actually have a trusting relationship. And believe it or not, trust is actually pretty durable. We all make mistakes. If we're honest about that stuff, we don't make them sort of consecutively and habitually, people will continue to trust us. I'm not advocating we break trust in relationships by any stretch, but it's probably got a lot more durability than we give it credit for. And then again, you get what you give in a relationship. If you want to be trusted, it helps to be trusting. People who are guarded tend to create the sense in others that they need to be guarded too. So we can kind of think about it in this area of these three P's of trust. There's a personal element of trust. There's sort of this paradoxical element of trusting and being trusted and giving and taking. And it's also an element of risk involved, right? There's an element of risk that goes into creating trusting relationships. And if you think about your relationships across the board, I think what you'll find is these things are true. We probably all know somebody that he or she doesn't seem to really trust anybody. But then you have to ask yourself, how does that impact the quality of their relationships? How does that manifest itself in their behaviors in those little interactions that happen between people when we exercise and challenge and build up trust? Now, one of the things that the trusted advisor talks about is this concept called the trust equation. So this is probably a little more practical than our model at the outset, although I actually think that's kind of practical too. We can calculate trust. You say, well, if you've never heard of this, it might seem a little peculiar. How do we think about it? Someone put it in the chat. We can kind of measure trust. And this gives us some insights to doing that. So if you remember that the sort of the dotted box over on the left-hand side of the model, the concept was the perception of trustworthiness. So that's capital T here. So trustworthiness is a function of four underlying variables, which I think fit very nicely in that other model. C plus R plus I divided by S. So these are the variables that we'll think about. So what are those variables? Well, they are as follows. C is credibility. Now think about it in terms of yourself. Are you credible in the workplace? Okay. Do you have the skills? Are you building those skills? Are you the kind of person that is seen as an expert or an authority or knowledgeable on the things that you do, regardless of what your role is, whether it's early career or the CEO of a company? The second variable is reliable. Are you reliable in the things that you say and do? If you make a promise, do you keep it? If you have a deadline, do you meet it? If you make a promise to somebody about something that you're going to follow through on it, are you going to keep that? So whether or not we think about it, we're evaluating the nature of our relationships by in some way looking at these and considering these variables that comprise them. And then the last one is intimacy in a professional setting. Do I know the people that I work with well? Do I have a good relationship with them? In my book, as was pointed out by Allison and my co-author Laura's, we talk about how to build relationships. And building relationships in the workplace and being liked is, being competent is really important. So if we have distant relationships, that has an impact on our perceived trustworthiness. And then it's all divided by, meaning it diminishes the impact of the perception of trustworthiness by our self-orientation. How much do we think about ourselves and our needs in relationships in the workplace versus others? Now, I like to ask people, have you ever worked for somebody that you really didn't trust? Okay. Have you ever had a boss And don't put the boss's name in. Go ahead and put it in the chat. What I want, not the person's name. What I want you to put in the chat is, what was it like working with someone who you felt like, maybe I really couldn't trust that person? What was that like? I'd be really interested. How did you feel it's discouraging. It's unbearable. Okay, that's pretty bad. It's stressful, right, Tanya? It's demoralizing. You have to be hyper vigilant, right? You don't know what's going to happen. Anything could pop out at any point in time. You're always on edge. See, I mean, there's a lack of reliability walking on. I mean, these are such great, what I love about these words is scared. That's unsafe. It's awful, right? If you think about back to why trust at work is important, it's all of the things that people are saying here. When trust is absent, you have to be over vigilant to make sure that something isn't going to fall out of place. Everything will be done the way it's supposed to. All the policies are followed. I mean, there's no sort of flexibility, right? It goes back to what we said at the outset, that really we don't have efficiency and effectiveness in the workplace if there's an absence of trust. So it's really important. The good news is we can calculate it. Sorry, I popped out for a second. So um, let's go back and take a look at the model a little more comprehensively. So one of the ways, or two ways, we can improve our trusting relationship is to focus on these two variables. The first one is intimacy on the numerator. We can get to know people and their strengths and the things that they need a little bit of help on in the workplace more effectively, in a more comprehensive way. And we can also shift the orientation in relationships away from ourselves and focus on the other person and their needs, right? And that's oftentimes very hard for us to do. It can be very challenging in a workplace setting because we're busy. If you're a supervisor, or a manager, or a leader, you got a lot of things to do. I really wish we could just get this done, but now I've got to talk to you about some other stuff. There's just the constant pressures that are occurring in the day-to-day jobs that we have that challenge us to really take the time to shift our focus and attention to other people and the orientation off of ourselves, right? The challenge for us is to build our relationships. Remember, again, trust is created in the interactions in the relationship. It can be hard to be thinking about and developing those things over time, but it's worth it. The more consistent we are in our relationships, the better able we are to enhance our performance in these variables, the higher our trust quotient will be, according to our authors. And by relationship, the better our trusting relationship will be in the workplace. So I think it's really, really important. Now, there's an interesting James make is narcissism part of the problem? If you've ever worked for someone who is a narcissist, their score on their self-orientation usually is pretty high. So what you end up seeing is you see a diminution of all of the other variables. And we tend not to trust them, right? Because they're looking out for themselves. They're not really thinking about my well-being or our team's well-being or those kinds of things. So all of these things, I think, generally are pretty accurate in the workplace. So think about for a minute, how trustworthy am I at work? And can I be more trustworthy and consequently have more trusting relationships? So think about that, especially in these two variables, in terms of building your relationship with your workplace colleagues and shifting your orientation away from yourself. Easier said than done, but there are some techniques. And I'm going to give you one thing to think about that should help you. And I would say, by and large, people are not very good at this one skill. I was actually just having a conversation last night with a couple of my kids about it. So the authors in Trusted Advisors say, look, there's 5 skills. Skill is something you can build. It's a big point of view of mine and my co-authors. And a lot of the work that we do is you can build your skills, meaning you could become better, more trustworthy, and have better trust-based relationships. And these 5 skills are listening, partnering with people, right? It's in the dyad, in the relationship. There's a partnership, there's a give and take. Having a willingness to take risks in a measured kind of way. Improvising, okay, things didn't work out. Let's come up with a different direction together because it's a partnership. And self-awareness, Mina just pointed out, know yourself. What are the things that I'm good at? What are the things I'm not good at? Being open to feedback, critical and constructive feedback, just alike, enhancing our ability as leaders and even as employees to be trusted in the workplace. Now, what do you think the one skill is that I'm going to share with you that people are not so good at? You should have figured it out by now. It's listening. People are generally not great at listening. That's just my perception, right? This is my perception. When I ask people who's a great listener in your life, they have to really think about it. It's like, who is a great listener? But let me ask you this. If you know someone in your life who is a great listener, it doesn't have to be just in the workplace, but that would be handy. What is it about that person's behavior that you believe gives you the perception they're a great listener? And you can put this in the chat. The real question is, what do great listeners actually do? They say, well, they listen. I get that, but like, what do they do? They're not thinking about the response. Undivided attention, eye contact. They stay silent because they're listening, right? You can build your listening muscle. They have body language, like they face you. They nod. Yeah, I understand. They validate the things that you're saying. They don't go from you said something to now I'm making a judgment. They're curious and interested versus they're engaging. They're active in their listening. They're empathetic. There's thanks, Evie. There's something going on behind the scenes, right? And I would say one of the keys to effective, the world is not equal in terms of contribution of actions to outcomes. They ask questions. Thanks, Elizabeth. So these five skills are important, but I would argue that listening is probably one of the multipliers insofar as, yes, the field book Rayhan actually appears very nicely with it's actually from the other book. But listening is one of those skills that I think has a disproportionate effect positively or negatively if you're not good at it on your workplace relationships. So enhancing your listening skills, which you can do, is I would argue is going to be an important component and a major contributor to enhancing your relationships, both at work, I would even say at home, right? So the idea is if you know people better, intimacy, and you're not focused on yourself or your to-do list, or look, I've just got a text that came in. I got to stop this. I got to stop this webinar so I can take this text. If you can shift away from those kinds of behaviors, you're going to start seeing over time the quality of your relationships go up. So a couple of things to think about. What keeps people from paying attention at work? Last question. Put in the chat. If it's so easy just to listen to people, and everything in the chat that people said is spot on, right? They look at you, they're silent, they paraphrase, they're really concerned. Seems pretty clear. Why don't people do it? What's happening? Well, they've got competing priorities. Yeah, there's stuff. I got to get to daycare, right? I got to go pick somebody up. Self-esteem is interesting, right? I'm thinking about myself more than you. We're all distracted. I've got the to-do list. Unfortunately, I'm stuck on this webinar, right, for another 20 minutes. I got to get to this other stuff, right? I'm just really not interested or engaged, just whatever. Sometimes people are uncomfortable in relationships. It takes work to actually be empathetic because you have to think about what people are saying. I think that there can be a fundamental element of respect. Do I respect other people sufficiently to give them the time and attention? And we're not fully present, right? And we live in a very distracted era. We have a million things going on. There's Slack, there's Teams, there's all kinds of things, IMs that are popping up. There's instant, there's texts that are coming in. So we've got all these things flowing around us that makes our job as listeners even more challenging, right? So when we distill it, these are all great. Yeah, overload. I've just got too many things going on. Yeah, some of it, Teddy, is ego and pride, right? There are things that keep us from listening. I would say they fall into these kinds of categories. At least the authors assert they do. You know what? The best way to improve my ability to communicate is talk more. No, it's actually not. It's listen more. We have a habit in conversations of airtime, of doing most of the talking. I was telling a funny anecdote to someone this morning. Actually, my son, we were talking on the way to work, and I worked with a person in another life who had a habituation of talking. Person talked all the time, and it is what it is, right? So we sat down to dinner one night. We went out. I thought it was funny. The person said to me, "Hey, I hardly know anything about you. Can you just tell me a little bit about yourself?" And I said, well, sure. Yeah, I live in Boston, and as soon as I said I live in Boston, person said, "Oh, Boston. Well, that's where my sister lives. In fact, my sister moved there about 5 years ago. She's really. I mean, it was all of a sudden the conversation has stopped about me and had started back about the things that were on this person's mind. So some of us have a habituation of talking that keeps us from listening effectively. And as many of you pointed out, we're distracted. Right? It can be hard to unplug from the thing I was just doing or the thing that's on my mind to give you, my focused attention while you're sitting here in front of me or while I'm talking to you on Zoom or whatnot. So there's all kinds of distractions that take us away. Back to the intimacy, right? Some of us fear to some degree, having too personal of a relationship with people. And we want to be measured and thoughtful about what we bring into the workplace, about what we share. That's a whole nother conversation. But the idea is we do want to know people at an appropriately personal level, a little bit about themselves, their background, their culture, what's important to them, what their aspirations are, things they're great at, things they're not so good at. Knowing those things not only goes into building a trust-based relationship, it helps us with teaming too, right? We're more effective at work when we know those things. And we always have that little voice in our head, right? We're always sort of that track is playing over and over that's either telling us we have to do something else or don't do this or this is while you're in this conversation, all these other things are happening. So we have to really work hard to be attentive to the things that we're doing, the attention that we're paying, the way we're listening in the relationships that we're in. It's really, really critically important, right? Yeah, it goes back to EQ. So there's really 5 skills that and sort of 9 ways to express empathy in relationships. And we all want to be heard, right? I think I can't remember, it was in Covey's book, The 7 Habits, but we have this deep desire to be heard and understood. If you've ever been in a conversation where you're trying to tell somebody something and they're just not understanding, maybe because they don't really care, they're not listening, it's frustrating. It's like, I'm just trying to tell you this. I just want you to hear me. You don't have to necessarily do anything, but I'd really want to be understood. So that's kind of one of the keys to really being a good listener is caring, right? And that goes back to the quality of your relationships, tuning in. Instead of tuning out because of all the other things we have going on, we want to try to tune in. And someone put this in a chat, I think a couple people did. You want to acknowledge what people are saying. In a conversation last night, I was talking to someone, I could tell they were getting worked up. And I said, I'm just getting sense you're getting really frustrated right now. Am I right? Are we on track here? Acknowledging how the person is feeling. Express yourselves non-verbally. Like that's the nodding, that's the non-verbal cues that show agreement or non-agreement, or let people know that you're in the conversation. Uh, Keeping it about them and not you. And that's back to my I'm from Boston conversation about the person I work with. Give the person the space and the time to share the things that are on their mind, how we show up. It's okay to be a little relaxed or zen or kind of take a deep breath or think about more expansively the things that are happening beyond what you're doing. We did a mindfulness activity here at work because we have a great mindfulness team on Monday, just stopping and like, what's going on around me? What do I hear? What am I experiencing? What's in the room right now? This sounds kind of silly, but it kind of grounds us in understanding that we're not just alone in the challenge that we have and the obligations day to day. We're part of a larger ecosystem, and it's okay. Let's just say loud. Sorry about that. It's okay to think out loud, and there are a lot of people that, and I think for a very good reason, they're talking through things. I just want to talk through this with you. I want to share what I'm thinking. They're looking for that thought partner, right? Back to this concept of being a partner in the relationship. So some of the things that we can say or do, just so to kind of fill them in and to help us a little, is in a conversation you can validate things. Yeah, that makes sense. I understand where you're coming from. Validation is not necessarily agreement, right? It's just an acknowledgement that, I'm hearing your concern. I had a conversation with someone this morning that said, oh, here's something that's happening at work. It's kind of frustrating. I said, yeah, I sense that too. But I also like to provide another way to maybe think about this that might be useful. And the person said, it really helps me to hear that. But at first, I wanted to validate the person's concern because I thought it was a valid concern. Restating or mirroring, you don't have to do it directly. Usually it's better if it's in your own words, like, hey, what I'm hearing you say is you're really delighted about this new opportunity. Is that right? And you can also ask for sort of accuracy. That's why I say, if I understood you correctly, it's very easy to misinterpret things in conversations. It's safe to say, hey, look, I want to be sure I got this. So if I heard you correctly, this is what you're experiencing. Is that right? Or in other words, this is another way to maybe frame what you're talking about. So let me understand your perspective. Back to this idea of I want to be heard and understood, right? This shows people that you're thinking about it from their standpoint, right? You're giving them, you're acknowledging that their viewpoint has, back to the second point, some validity to it. I really appreciate, again, you don't have to agree with them, but I appreciate that you're frustrated. I appreciate it's disappointing, the situation. You can be, I appreciate it's unnerving to work for someone who makes you feel like they can't be trusted or you can't be trusted, irritating, et cetera. Fill in the descriptor here, but you're acknowledging the other person's feelings. And a lot of us really just, I want you to understand how I'm feeling right now. And if I would, if I were in your shoes, I would be frustrated too. If I was experiencing this kind of issue, I'd be so delighted. I'd be really frustrated. I'm just playing these. These are what I'm doing just to demonstrate these are the kinds of things, right? And then lastly, some empathy. I feel badly that, I feel bad that you have to go through this all. I'm so happy for you. I think the idea here is we want to empathize with people. In order to do that effectively, we got to listen to them. We really have to pay attention to what they're saying. And it is true. I don't think the 80% of it is true. Actually, that's been debunked. But the idea is the nonverbals do help us understand what's going on potentially behind the scenes, beyond what the person is just saying. So the last thing to think about is a simple activity that we do here at school, and I would encourage you to do this. You have a team. You can actually get better at this. Since it is a skill, you can practice it. So what I love to do is get people into triads. And what you do in a triad is you just have somebody talk about something basic, their weekend, something they're going through, or an experience. It doesn't have to be super personal. But you identify three different roles. There's a speaker. Some of you may have even done this. There's a listener, and then there's an observer. And the three people is kind of important. I'll explain why. So the unit of analysis here for our purposes is actually the listener. Although it's hard sometimes because the observer oftentimes gets caught up in what the speaker is saying if the story is engaging, but that's not the point. The idea here is the speaker says, I'm going to tell you a 2-minute story about what I did over the weekend. The listener's job is to listen with empathy. So it's to do all the things that we talked about. It's to pay attention, to be present in the conversation, to use nonverbal, responses, to paraphrase, say, ask questions that are not an interrogation, but give the, you as if you're listening, some insights into the conversation, and the speaker, the understanding that, yeah, the person is following along. The observer's job is just to look at the listener and ask, and you kind of take notes on or put in your phone, like, is that person paying attention? Are they being distracted? Are they asking the kinds of questions that are appropriate to a response or a follow-up to deepen their understanding? Are there the things that are they're doing that are positive, or is there some things that they might want to do differently? So you could do this with your team. It's a really useful way to get people to think about how to improve their listening skills and then talk about it. What went well? What could you do differently, right? So again, going back to the trust equation, we can get better at these things in terms of credibility, reliability, intimacy in particular, and our self-orientation. This is a simple activity to help us do that. All right. So what we talked about today, just to kind of summarize, I'm sure there's a question or two, a lot of great chat comments. So I appreciate that. Look, trust is a really important of all relationships, especially at work, right? You can't get things done at work. It's very inefficient. As you pointed out in the chat, if you don't trust people. And if we can't be trusted, it's going to be hard to have an effective functioning workplace. In a dyadic relationship, there's someone who trusts and someone who is trusted. The trustee, we saw those skills, right? There's their individual technical skills, there's their desire, there's personal values, otherwise called benevolence and ability. And then the truster has to be able to trust people. If you everything back to my example of flying, if you have to verify everything, that's going to take a lot of time, right? So there's sort of a level of risk that we want to engage in. You can calculate trust, right? Beyond the introductory model that we have, we can use the trust equation for ourselves, or even when we think about the relationships that we have in general, and we can enhance those, especially if we focus on the relationship or the intimacy and self-orientation. And one of the big drivers of that from the skill standpoint of the five we talked about is really listening. If you want to enhance your relationships, build your trust and your ability to have quality relationships both at home and at work on your listening skills and really understanding where people are coming from. That's the challenge for you going forward. So Allison, I think with that, we'll turn it back over to any questions that we have as we wrap
Thank,
up.
thank you so much. This was
Sure.
absolutely great. And thank you to all of you for your incredible contributions to the chat and to the Q&A. And we do have some great
Oh,
questions.
good.
I would say that the number one that I am seeing pop up over and over again in different ways is just how do you restore trust once it's broken?
Yes, there's the idea that once trust is broken, I'll never trust you again. That sounds very important and impressive. You have to go back to the variables. Acknowledge you made a mistake, acknowledge it. There's another miracle of behavior at work and in relationships. It's called apologizing properly. To, acknowledge what you did, acknowledge how what you did was inappropriate, the impact it had on the other party, and what you will do substantively to change that. And you can build trust back by, again, going back to the elements in the equation. being credible, being reliable, knowing that person, understanding that things need to be repaired, and focusing your attention and your orientation on the other party. It can be done. We all make mistakes. That's just the reality of things. Where we have problems with trust, where it's like, I didn't make a mistake. It's actually you made the mistake. I mean, we don't acknowledge it. We don't own up to it. And we don't necessarily attend to repairing the relationship in instances where it's been impacted. It's a good question.
Thank you. The other question that's come up in a couple of different flavors is how do you coach others in restoring trust? So, in one case, there is a person who has some trust, it was where there is low trust towards them at work. And now this person is reporting to our question asker. So, how do they coach this person to kind of regain trust at work?
Mhm.
And in another situation, it's a specific team where
Right.
4 out of 5 of the coworkers get along just fine, but there's one person causing friction. So, in both of those types of cases, how do you coach that person to become more trustworthy?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. So there's a couple of things at least to think about. So I would say the variables still stand. The question then becomes how do we go about it? So there's always the question of how do you get some what we would hope is objective feedback, and then how does the person perceive or internalize that? So I'm a big fan of some type of objective assessment. It's a team assessment. We do the 5 dysfunctions. We just did it. Allison, I just did this last week. Whether it's an individual assessment on a 360, that's usually a good starting point. I'm trying to get objective feedback and see how it lands with the person, as opposed to saying, hey, I just want to be honest, I don't think anyone really trusts you. That's usually not going to land very well. So the idea is to try to get at it through some objective data, ideally. Or at least if you can't do that, try to ask the person, how do you think your relationships are going? Or even in a team-based setting, say, what are some of the things on this team that we can do better? And then try to have that conversation with that person where they really try to help them understand what the impact of their behavior on the situation. Some people will get that, some people will not as much. But I think using objective data and information is probably one of the better ways, not the only way, but one of the better ways to go about that.
Thank you. And I think this will likely be the last question that we have time for.
Sure.
And this question asks, what role does identity play in building trust?
I'm not, well, when you say identity, what would need to define what identity means?
Yeah, good question. That's all the actual text has, but my guess is
Sure.
that I'm imagining that they're asking about like social identity. Like, is there any research that finds that there's maybe baseline more trust kind of given unfairly to, white men perhaps? Or,
Sure.
like what do different facets of identity, how do they interact with this concept of gaining, earning, and keeping trust?
Yeah, I mean, so I couldn't speak knowledgeably at this point about to what degree do we trust one person's identity or identity from being associated with one group or another. I do think it's true that there's research out there that suggests we are more likely to give credibility to certain genders and backgrounds and educational levels than other people. I think that's just a feature of the society that we live in and many of the workplaces that we work in. That being said, I think as a leader or a manager or someone in a dyadic relationship, we want to try to understand somebody's identity as a person, right? We want to try to understand their individual identity so we can build a relationship with them that takes into account who they are, what's important to them, and what they need or want out of a relationship, because that varies by person, right? Even when I was in the military, in my background, you say I'm leading a team of so many people. In reality, I've always felt, this is a personal view, you're really leading one person at a time on the team because they all have I'm motivated by money. I'm motivated by time off. I just want a good job. I don't want to be here, right? Everyone has a very different set of motivations. And I think ultimately a leader's job or anybody's job at work is to try to understand what's everybody's unique individual identity and the motivations that flow from that because they're different.
I love that. Thank you. I've never really heard that before. Like you're
Well, it doesn't make
really
it right,
leading.
Allison.
No, it resonates that you're really leading one person at a time and that leads the team in turn. That resonates. So thank you so much. It's a
Sure.
great note to end on. And thank you everyone who joined us, who participated in the chat, who asked incredible
Mary has her hand up
questions.
too if she wants to send something, and after we can get back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And we will be sending a recording afterwards. A couple people asked that question. You will get a recording afterwards. And also, we have a lot of different ways for you to continue to learn from Ed and other incredible faculty here. So we hope we get to see you in a
Yeah,
virtual or in-person classroom soon. Thank you, everyone, so much. I hope you have a great holiday season, and we'll
yeah,
resume
absolutely.
these monthly webinars in the new year. So take care, everyone. Bye.
Take care.